Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of Whose Body?, the first of the Lord Peter Wimsey murder mysteries by Dorothy L. Sayers. Lord Peter is investigating the appearance of a corpse in somebody's bathtub. But this time we're not actually going to see much of Lord Peter. Instead, we're going to hear the coroner's inquest. It was, in fact, inconvenient for Mr. Parker to leave London. He had had to go and see Lady Levy toward the end of the morning, and subsequently his plans for the day had been thrown out of gear and his movements delayed by the discovery that the adjourned inquest of Mr. Thipps's unknown visitor was to be held that afternoon, since nothing very definite seemed forthcoming from Inspector Sugg's inquiries. Jury and witnesses had been convened accordingly for 3 o'clock. Mr. Parker might altogether have missed the event had he not run against Sugg that morning at the yard and extracted the information from him as one would a reluctant tooth. Inspector Sugg, indeed, considered Mr. Parker rather interfering. Moreover, he was hand in glove with Lord Peter Wimsey, and Inspector Sugg had no words for the interferingness of Lord Peter. He could not, however, when directly questioned, deny that there was to be an inquest that afternoon, nor could he prevent Mr. Parker from enjoying the inalienable right of any interested British citizen to be present. At a little before 3, therefore, Mr. Parker was in his place and amusing himself with watching the efforts of those persons who arrived after the room was packed to insinuate, bribe, or bully themselves into a position of vantage. The coroner, a medical man of precise habits and unimaginative aspect, arrived punctually, and looking peevishly round at the crowded assembly, directed all the windows to be opened, thus letting in a stream of drizzling fog upon the heads of the unfortunates on that side of the room. This caused a commotion and some expressions of disapproval, checked sternly by the coroner, who said that with the influenza about again, an unventilated room was a death trap, that anybody who chose to object to open windows had the obvious remedy of leaving the court, and further, that if any disturbance was made, he would clear the court. He then took a formament lozenge and proceeded, after the usual preliminaries, to call up 14 good and lawful persons and swear them diligently to inquire and a true presentment make of all matters touching the death of the gentleman with the pince-nez, and to give a true verdict according to the evidence, so help them God. When an expostulation by a woman juror, an elderly lady in spectacles who kept a sweet shop and appeared to wish she was back there, had been summarily quashed by the coroner, the jury departed to view the body. Mr. Parker gazed round again and identified the unhappy Mr. Thipps and the girl Gladys, led into an adjoining room under the grim guard of the police. They were soon followed by a gaunt old lady in a bonnet and mantle. With her, in a wonderful fur coat and a motor bonnet of fascinating construction, came the Dowager Duchess of Denver, her quick dark eyes darting hither and thither about the crowd. The next moment they had lighted on Mr. Parker, who had several times visited the Dower House, and she nodded to him and spoke to a policeman. Before long, a way opened magically through the press, and Mr. Parker found himself accommodated with his front seat just behind the Duchess, who greeted him charmingly and said, "What's happened to poor Peter?" Parker began to explain, and the coroner glanced irritably in their direction. Somebody went up and whispered in his ear, at which he coughed and took another formament. "We came up by car," said the Duchess. "So tiresome, such bad roads between Denver and Gunbury St. Walters. And there were people coming to lunch. I had to put them off. I couldn't let the old lady go alone, could I? By the way, such an odd thing's happened about the Church Restoration Fund. The vicar— Oh dear, here are those people coming back again. Well, I'll tell you afterwards. Do look at that woman looking shocked, and the girl in tweeds trying to look as if she sat on undraped gentlemen every day of her life. I don't mean that. Corpses, of course, but one finds oneself being so Elizabethan nowadays. What an awful little man the coroner is, isn't he? He's looking daggers at me. Do you think he'll dare to clear me out of the court or commit me for whatchamacallit?" The first part of the evidence was not of great interest to Mr. Parker. The wretched Mr. Thipps, who had caught cold in jail, deposed in an unhappy croak to having discovered the body when he went in to take his bath at 8 o'clock. He had had such a shock, he had to sit down and send the girl for brandy. He had never seen the deceased before. He had no idea how he came there. Yes, he had been in Manchester the day before. He had arrived at St. Pancras at 10 o'clock. He had cloak-roomed his bag. At this point, Mr. Thipps became very red, unhappy, and confused, and glanced nervously about the court. "Now, Mr. Phipps," said the coroner briskly, "we must have your movements quite clear. You must appreciate the importance of the matter. You have chosen to give evidence which you need not have done, but having done so, you will find it best to be perfectly explicit." "Yes," said Mr. Phipps faintly. "Have you cautioned this witness, officer?" inquired the coroner, turning sharply to Inspector Sugg. The inspector replied that he had told Mr. Phipps that anything he said might be used against him at his trial. Mr. Phipps became ashy and said in a bleating voice that he hadn't meant to do anything that wasn't right. This remark produced a mild sensation, and the coroner became even more acidulated in manner than before. "Is anybody representing Mr. Phipps?" he asked irritably. "No? Did you not explain to him that he ought to be represented? You did not? Really, Inspector? Did you not know, Mr. Phipps, that you have a right to be legally represented?" Mr. Phipps clung to a chair back for support and said, "No," in a voice barely audible. "It is incredible," said the coroner, "that so-called educated people should be so ignorant of the legal procedures of their own country. This places us in a very awkward position. I doubt, Inspector, whether I should permit the prisoner, Mr. Phipps, to give evidence at all. It is a delicate position." The perspiration stood out on Mr. Phipps' forehead. "Save us from our friends," whispered the Duchess to Parker. "If that cough-drop-devouring creature had openly instructed those 14 people, and what unfinished-looking faces they have, so characteristic, I always think, of the lower middle class, rather like sheep or calves' heads, boiled, I mean, to bring in willful murder against the poor little man, he couldn't have made himself plainer." "He can't let him incriminate himself, you know," said Parker. "Stuff," said the Duchess. "How could the man incriminate himself when he never did anything in his life? You men never think of anything but your red tape." Meanwhile, Mr. Phipps, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, had summoned up courage. He stood up with a kind of weak dignity, like a small rabbit brought to bay. "I would rather tell you," he said, "though it's really very unpleasant for a man in my position, but I really couldn't have it thought for a moment that I'd committed this dreadful crime. I assure you, gentlemen, I couldn't bear that. No, I'd rather tell you the truth, though I'm afraid it places me in rather a— well, I'll tell you." "You fully understand the gravity of making such a statement, Mr. Phipps?" said the coroner. "Quite," said Mr. Phipps. "That it's all right. Might I have a drink of water?" "Take your time," said the coroner, at the same time robbing his remark of all conviction by impatiently glancing at his watch. "Thank you," said Mr. Phipps. "Well, then, it's true I got to St. Pancras at 10, but there was a man in the carriage with me. He'd got in at Leicester. I didn't recognize him at first, but he turned out to be an old schoolfellow of mine." "What was this gentleman's name?" inquired the coroner, his pencil poised. Mr. Phipps shrank together visibly. "I'm afraid I can't tell you that," he said. "You see, that is, you will see, it would get him into trouble, and I couldn't do that. No, I really couldn't do that, not if my life depended on it. No," he added, as the ominous pertinence of the last phrase smote upon him, "I'm sure I couldn't do that." "Well, well," said the coroner. The Duchess leaned over to Parker again. "I'm quite beginning to admire the little man," she said. Mr. Phipps resumed. "When we got to St. Pancras, I was going home, but my friend said no, we hadn't met for a long time, and we ought to make a night of it, was his expression. I fear I was weak, and let him over-persuade me to accompany him to one of his haunts. I use the word advisedly," said Mr. Phipps, "and I assure you, sir, that if I had known beforehand where we were going, I never would have set foot in the place. I cloak-roomed my bag, for he did not like the notion of our being encumbered with it, and we got into a taxicab and drove to the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street. We then walked a little way and turned into a side street, I do not recollect which, where there was an open door with the light shining out. There was a man at a counter, and my friend bought some tickets, and I heard the man at the counter say something to him about your friend, meaning me, and my friend said, 'Oh, yes, he's been here before, haven't you, Alf?' which was what they called me at school, though I assure you, sir," here Mr. Phipps grew very earnest, "I never had, and nothing in the world would induce me to go to such a place again. Well, we went down into a room underneath where there were drinks, and my friend had several and made me take one or two, though I am an abstemious man as a rule, and he talked to some other men and girls who were there, a very vulgar set of people, I thought them, though I wouldn't say but what some of the young ladies were nice-looking enough. One of them sat on my friend's knee and called him a slow old thing and told him to come on, So we went into another room where there were a lot of people dancing all these up-to-date dances. My friend went and danced, and I sat on a sofa. One of the young ladies came up to me and said, didn't I dance? And I said no. So she said, wouldn't I stand her a drink then? You'll stand us a drink then, darling, was what she said. And I said, wasn't it after hours? And she said that it didn't matter. So I ordered the drink, a gin and bitters it was, for I didn't like not to. The young lady seemed to expect it of me, and I felt it wouldn't be gentlemanly to refuse when she asked, but it went against my conscience, such a young girl as she was. And she put her arm round my neck afterwards and kissed me just as if she was paying for the drink. And it really went to my heart, said Mr. Thipps, a little ambiguously, but with uncommon emphasis. Here somebody at the back said, "Cheero," and a sound was heard as of the noisy smacking of lips. "Remove the person who made that improper noise," said the coroner with great indignation. "Go on, please, Mr. Thipps." "Well," said Mr. Thipps, "about 12:30, as I should reckon, things began to get a bit lively, and I was looking for my friend to say good night, not wishing to stay longer, you'll understand, when I saw him with one of the young ladies, and they seemed to be getting on altogether too well, if you follow me, my friend pulling the ribbons off her shoulder, and the young lady laughing, and so on," said Mr. Thipps hurriedly. "So I thought I'd just slip quietly out, when I heard a scuffle and a shout, and before I knew what had happened, there were half a dozen policemen in, and the lights went out, and everybody stampeding and shouting. Quite horrid it was. I was knocked down in the rush and hit my head a nasty knock on a chair. That was where I got that bruise they asked me about, and I was dreadfully afraid I'd never get away, and it would all come out, and perhaps my photograph in the papers, when someone caught hold of me. I think it was the young lady I'd given the gin and bitters to, and she said, 'This way,' and pushed me along a passage and out at the back somewhere. So I ran through some streets and found myself in Goodge Street, and there I got a taxi and came home. I saw the account of the raid afterward in the papers and saw my friend had escaped, and so, as it wasn't the sort of thing I wanted made public, and I didn't want him to get into difficulties, I just said nothing. But that's the truth." "Well, Mr. Thipps," said the coroner, "we shall be able to substantiate a certain amount of this story. Your friend's name—" "No," said Mr. Thipps stoutly, "not on any account." "Very good," said the coroner. "Now, can you tell us what time you did get in?" "About 1:30, I should think, though really I was so upset." "Quite so. Did you go straight to bed?" "Yes, I took my sandwich and glass of milk first. I thought it might settle my inside, so to speak," added the witness apologetically, "not being accustomed to alcohol so late at night and on an empty stomach, as you may say." "Quite so. Nobody sat up for you?" "Nobody." "How long did you take getting to bed first and last?" Mr. Thipps thought it might have been half an hour. "Did you visit the bathroom before turning in?" "No." "And you heard nothing in the night?" "No, I fell fast asleep. I was rather agitated, so I took a little dose to make me sleep, and what with being so tired, and the milk and the dose, I just tumbled right off, and didn't wake till Gladys called me." Further questioning elicited little from Mr. Thipps. Yes, the bathroom window had been open when he went in the morning, he was sure of that, and he had spoken very sharply to the girl about it. He was ready to answer any questions. He would be only too happy to have this dreadful affair sifted to the bottom. Gladys Horrocks stated that she had been in Mr. Thipps' employment about 3 months. Her previous employers would speak to her character. It was her duty to make the round of the flat at night when she had seen Mrs. Thipps to bed at 10. Yes, she remembered doing so on Monday evening. She had looked into all the rooms. Did she recollect shutting the bathroom window that night? Well, no, she couldn't swear to it, not in particular, but when Mr. Thipps called her into the bathroom in the morning, it certainly was open. She had not been into the bathroom before Mr. Thipps went in. Well, yes, it had happened that she had left that window open before, when anyone had been having a bath in the evening and had left the blind down. Mrs. Thipps had had a bath on Monday morning. Mondays was one of her regular bath nights. She was very much afraid she hadn't shut the window on Monday night, though she wished her head had been cut off before she'd been so forgetful. Here the witness burst into tears and was given some water while the coroner refreshed himself with a third lozenge. Recovering, the witness stated she had certainly looked into all the rooms before going to bed. No, it was quite impossible for a body to be hidden in the flat without her seeing it. She had been in the kitchen all evening, and there wasn't hardly room to keep the best dinner service there, let alone a body. Old Mrs. Thipps sat in the drawing room. Yes, she was sure she'd been into the dining room. How? Because she put Mr. Thipps' milk and sandwiches there ready for him. There had been nothing in there, that she could swear to, nor yet in her own bedroom, nor in the hall. Had she searched the bedroom cupboard and the box room? Well, no, not to say searched. She wasn't used to searching people's houses for skeletons every night. So that a man might have been concealed in the box room or a wardrobe? She supposed he might. In reply to a woman juror, well, yes, she was walking out with a young man. Williams was his name, Bill Williams. Well, yes, William Williams, if they insisted. He was a glazier by profession. Well, yes, he had been to the flat sometimes. Well, she supposed you might say he was acquainted with the flat. Had she ever? No, she hadn't, and if she'd thought such a question was going to be put to a respectable girl, she wouldn't have offered to give evidence. The vicar of St. Mary's would speak to her character and to Mr. Williams's. Last time Mr. Williams was at the flat was a fortnight ago. Well, no, it wasn't exactly the last time she'd seen Mr. Williams. Well, yes, the last time was Monday. Well, yes, Monday night. Well, if she must tell the truth, she must. Yes, the officer had cautioned her, but there wasn't any harm in it, and it was better to lose her place than to be hung, though it was a cruel shame a girl couldn't have a bit of fun without a nasty corpse coming in through the window and getting her into difficulties. After she had put Mrs. Thipps to bed, she had slipped out to the plumbers' and glaziers' ball at the Black-Faced Ram. Mr. Williams had met her and brought her back. He could testify to where she'd been and that there wasn't no harm in it. She'd left before the end of the ball. It might have been 2 o'clock when she got back. She'd got the keys from the flat from Mrs. Thipps' drawer when Mrs. Thipps wasn't looking. She'd asked leave to go, but couldn't get it, along with Mr. Thipps being away that night. She was bitterly sorry she'd behaved so, and she was sure she'd been punished for it. She had heard nothing suspicious when he came in. He'd gone straight to bed without looking round the flat. She wished she were dead. No, Mr. and Mrs. Thipps didn't hardly ever have any visitors. They kept themselves very retired. She had found the outside door bolted as usual that morning. She wouldn't never believe any harm of Mr. Thipps. Thank you, Miss Horrocks. Call Georgina Thipps, and the coroner thought we had better light the gas. The examination of Mrs. Thipps proved more entertainment than enlightenment, affording as it did an excellent example of the game called cross questions and crooked answers. After 15 minutes' suffering, both in voice and temper, the coroner abandoned the struggle, leaving the lady with the last word. "You needn't try to bully me, young man," said the octogenarian with spirit, "settin' there spoilin' your stomach with them nasty jujubes." At this point, a young man arose in court and demanded to give evidence. Having explained that he was William Williams, glazier, he was sworn and corroborated the evidence of Gladys Horrocks in the manner of her presence at the Black-Faced Ram on the Monday night. They had returned to the flat rather before 2, he thought, but certainly later than 1:30. He was sorry that he had persuaded Miss Horrocks to come out with him when she didn't ought. He had observed nothing of a suspicious nature in Prince of Williams Road at either visit. Inspector Sugg gave evidence of having been called in at about 8:30 on Monday morning. He had considered the girl's manner to be suspicious and had arrested her. On later information leading him to suspect that the deceased might have been murdered that night, he had arrested Mr. Thipps. He had found no trace of breaking into the flat. There were marks on the bathroom windowsill which pointed to somebody having got in that way. There were no ladder marks or footmarks in the yard. The yard was paved with asphalt. He had examined the roof but found nothing on the roof. In his opinion, the body had been brought into the flat previously and concealed till the evening by someone who had then gone out during the night by the bathroom window with the connivance of the girl. In that case, why should not the girl have let the person out by the door? Well, it might have been so. Had he found traces of a body or a man or both having been hidden in the flat? He found nothing to show that they might not have been so concealed. What was the evidence that led him to suppose that the death had occurred that night? At this point, Inspector Sugg appeared uneasy and endeavored to retire upon his professional dignity. On being pressed, however, he admitted that the evidence in question had come to nothing. One of the jurors. Was it the case that any finger marks had been left by the criminal? Some marks had been found on the bath, but the criminal had worn gloves. The coroner. Do you draw any conclusion from this fact as to the experience of the criminal? Inspector Sugg. Looks as if he was an old hand, sir. The juror. Is that very consistent with the charge against Alfred Thipps, Inspector? The inspector was silent. The coroner. In light of the evidence which you have just heard, do you still press the charge against Alfred Thipps and Gladys Horrocks? Inspector Sugg. I consider the whole set out highly suspicious. Thipps' story isn't corroborated, and as for the girl Horrocks, how do we know this Williams ain't in it as well? William Williams. Now you drop that. I can bring 100 witnesses. Coroner. Silence, if you please. I am surprised, Inspector, that you should make this suggestion in that manner. It is highly improper. By the way, can you tell us whether a police raid was actually carried out on the Monday night on any nightclub in the neighborhood of St. Giles Circus? Inspector Sugg, sulkily. I believe there was something of the sort. The coroner. You will no doubt inquire into the matter. I seem to recollect having seen some mention of it in the newspapers. Thank you, Inspector. That will do. Several witnesses having appeared and testified to the characters of Mr. Thipps and Gladys Horrocks, the coroner stated his intention of proceeding to the medical evidence. Sir Julian Freke. There was considerable stir in the court as the great specialist walked up to give evidence. He was not only a distinguished man, but a striking figure, with wide shoulders, upright carriage, and leonine head. His manner, as he kissed the book presented to him with the usual deprecatory mumble by the coroner's officer, was that of St. Paul condescending to humor the timid mumbo-jumbo of superstitious Corinthians. So handsome, I always think, whispered the Duchess to Mr. Parker, just exactly like William Morris, with that bush of hair and beard and those exciting eyes to look out of it. So splendid, these dear men, always devoted to something or other. Not but what I think socialism is a mistake. Of course it works with all those nice people, so good and happy in art linen, and the weather always perfect. Morris, I mean, you know, but so difficult in real life. Science is different. I'm sure if I had nerves, I should go to Sir Julian just to look at him. Eyes like that give someone to think about, and that's what most of these people really want, only I never had any. Nerves, I mean. Don't you think so? You are Sir Julian Freke, said the coroner, and live at St. Luke's House, Prince of Wales Road, Battersea, where you exercise a general direction over the surgical side of St. Luke's Hospital? Sir Julian assented briefly to this definition of his personality. You were the first medical man to see the deceased? I was. And you have since conducted an examination in collaboration with Dr. Grimbold of Scotland Yard? I have. You are in agreement as to the cause of death? Generally speaking, yes. Will you communicate your impressions to the jury? I was engaged in research work in the dissecting room at St. Luke's Hospital at about 9 o'clock on Monday morning when I was informed that Inspector Sugg wished to see me. He had told me that the dead body of a man had been discovered under mysterious circumstances at 59 Queen Caroline Mansions. He asked me whether it could be supposed to be a joke perpetuated by any of the medical students at the hospital. I was able to assure him by an examination of the hospital's books that there was no subject missing from the dissecting room. Who would be in charge of such bodies? William Watts, the dissecting room attendant. Is William Watts present? Inquired the coroner of the officer. William Watts was present and could be called if the coroner thought it necessary. I suppose no dead body would be delivered to the hospital without your knowledge, Sir Julian? Certainly not. Thank you. Will you proceed with your statement? Inspector Sugg then asked me whether I would send a medical man round to view the body. I said that I would go myself. Why did you do that? I confess to my share of ordinary human curiosity, Mr. Coroner. Laughter from a medical student at the back of the room. On arriving at the flat, I found the deceased lying on his back in the bath. I examined him and came to the conclusion that death had been caused by a blow on the back of the neck, dislocating the 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae, bruising the spinal cord, and producing internal hemorrhage and partial paralysis of the brain. I judged the deceased to have been dead at least 12 hours, possibly more. I observed no other sign of violence of any kind upon the body. Deceased was a strong, well-nourished man of about 50 to 55 years of age. In your opinion, could the blow have been self-inflicted? Certainly not. It had been made with a heavy, blunt instrument from behind, with great force and considerable judgment. It was quite impossible that it was self-inflicted. Could it have been the result of an accident? That is, of course, possible. If, for example, the deceased had been looking out of the window and the sash had shut violently down upon him? No, in that case there would have been signs of strangulation and a bruise upon the throat as well. But deceased might have been killed through a heavy weight accidentally falling upon him? He might. Was death instantaneous, in your opinion? It is difficult to say. Such a blow might very well cause death instantaneously, or the patient might linger in a partially paralyzed condition for some time. In the present case, I should be disposed to think that the deceased might have lingered for some hours. I base my decision upon the condition of the brain revealed in the autopsy. I may say, however, that Dr. Grimbold and I are not in complete agreement on this point. I understand that a suggestion has been made as to the identification of the deceased. You are not in a position to identify him? Certainly not. I never saw him before. The suggestion to which you refer to is a preposterous one and ought never to have been made. I was not aware until this morning that it had been made. Had it been made to me earlier, I should have known how to deal with it, and I should like to express my strong disapproval of the unnecessary shock and distress inflicted upon a lady with whom I have the honor to be acquainted. The coroner. It was not my fault, Sir Julian. I had nothing to do with it. I agree with you that it was unfortunate you were not consulted. And we will continue with Sir Julian's testimony next time.